Thanks very much, Marie, for that lovely introduction. And thanks very much for inviting me. And organizers, I'm very pleased and honored to be participating in this conference organized by AXA. But also, when I received the invitation, I noticed Sara's and Judith's presence here, and that particularly gave me a cause for happiness to contribute. And especially after yesterday, that happiness became a feeling of being over the moon. So I'm very, very happy to be here. It all started about a year ago, just about this week. There were news about the plans of some London boroughs to move housing benefit claimants to cheaper parts of the country. The London Borough Newham apparently had contacted housing associations as far as Stoke-on-Trent, for those of you who don't know, about 250 kilometers from London, about leasing properties to Newham residents. The argument was that the cap introduced by the government on local housing allowance, which also is called social housing benefits, would make it impossible for many people to afford to continue living in London. This benefit, or what used to be called a social right, covers the cost of housing and legally has to be paid to the landlord, so it cannot be kept by beneficiaries. Clearly, with the cap, it would become impossible to cover the cost of housing, as the rents in London, despite 5 years of economic crisis, kept rising. This is primarily because London is marketed as a center for global financial and cultural capital. The response to the news was rather muted, but a report did suggest that, quote, the thought of families being uprooted and moved hundreds of miles in search of cheap accommodation is a horrible one. And the government may claim with some justification that such policies are not necessary. This is a confusing statement that will become more clear, the rift between local councils and the government. But they are simply extreme examples of a housing benefit system that is overwhelmed and a housing market that is utterly broken. The benefit cap is starting on 15th of April, as Marie suggested, and originally it's going to apply to 4 boroughs, and Newham and then Camden, that were matters of concern. We're not even on the list yet, but it is going to apply to all London boroughs by the end of this year. In any event, after a very brief period, this news disappeared just about a year ago and faded into history without much discussion. But a few weeks ago, the news returned. And this time, there was a much more urgency. For one thing, the welfare cap now was to come into effect on 15th of April. On 13th February 2013, Guardian reported, I'm quoting now from Guardian reporting, Camden Council said that it would shortly be contacting 761 households, comprising 2,816 adults and children, because the coalition's benefit cap, which limits total welfare payments to £500 a week for families, will mean that they will be unable to afford their current accommodation or any other home in the southeast. Camden says it's been forced to act because the government's policy does not recognize the capital's local circumstances. The borough has the 4th highest rents in the country. Now, if you recall, I mentioned the tension between local councils and central government. The fact that this became news, and particularly the urging of the council, may well be also a strategy to gain leverage against the central government. So I'm not suggesting that, in fact, and nobody suggested that Camden is going to proceed with these plans. But as you will see, that it's less of a concern for me whether it proceeds or not, but the discourse that it precipitated. Now, this piece was written by Randeep Ramesh, social affairs editor in Guardian, and it had a number of benefit recipients' voices. It reported, for example, quote, one single mother in Camden with 4 children, all under the age of 10, told The Guardian, I want to stay where I am for my children's education. What it seems like the government just wants London for the rich. They want to move people on benefits to poor areas. Her rent is £340 for a two-bedroom flat in Camden, and when the cap comes into effect, the government will reduce her housing subsidy to £204, and this leaves a shortfall of £136. The council has offered to rehouse her in Liverpool. There are a number of ways interpreting this event. Many scholars would approach it perhaps within the context of changing welfare state and interpret with them broader changes introduced by the government. Many social policy analysts would approach it in terms of changing social benefits, social welfare state, and perhaps even the transformations of social rights. But I propose to approach it from a different angle. And that angle was suggested to me when I was equally quite shocked by the news of what would have been called deportation or forced migration if another legal framework was in place. But because it was the space of sovereign space, it wasn't called that. It was just simply a technical decision and its effects. And as I was following this piece, 2,850 comments were placed in response to this piece written in The Guardian. That became my object of concern, trying to understand what actually people were thinking through, and were there any preponderant or prevailing logics that were at work in this body of thought, as it were. So this piece then occasioned with this unique outburst of comments, and which was considerable, the numbers. I mean, if you compare with the commentaries on football and so on in Britain, even it's more than that. So it was considerable concern about that. And they express a logic that I want to isolate. I was not aware of this logic in the beginning, but I became more and more sort of taken in by a thread running through these comments. But I will first focus on some of these comments. Then I will trace that logic in a deeper transformation of the state from my point of view. And rather than interpreting it as a change of the welfare state, I will suggest that something different is happening. And that is really the main concern for me today, to be able to get through as a question. Now, over about roughly 48 hours until The Guardian closed the debate, all 2,850 comments amount to some 500 pages and 166,000 words. So it's very difficult to interpret and analyze such a body of thought. I've read these comments, and it's been an experience of, simultaneous experience of incredulity, humility, wonderment, despair, at times hope, often hopelessness. But I'll have to be selective this morning and read some samples to get a grip on various ideas expressed in these comments. It opens with a sense of scandal that gets expressed with a reference to Nazi removals of deportation. Although the Nazi reference gets repudiated as the debate grows, the sense of scandal, or at least incredulity, persists. Yet, it is the comments that shrug their shoulders, almost saying, scandal, what scandal, are equally powerful and eventually become dominant. Were these families deported? Some said explicitly that this amounted to deportation, whether one used the term Nazi or not. For others, this was not deportation. One of the interesting things, of course, follow these commentaries and the public outburst of thoughts. One observation is that there is the rule of anonymity. Those who choose to be anonymous can be anonymous. There are, of course, both negative and positive aspects about that. Anonymity allows people to express things otherwise they would have been fearful of expressing. But at the same time, it creates this terrifying space where people feel they can bring out, without realizing, the most racist, misogynist, ethnocentric views to bear on issues as they debate. And then there is this, Guardian established these community standards. And if certain comments don't comply with community standards, they actually remove them, but they leave the trace of the comment, so you know that it's removed. Now, to that, also I have developed these two responses. On the one hand, reading as comments as I will read, if those are actually conforming with community standards, you wonder about the ones that they deleted. That's one response. And then the other response is this, such removals come through a strand, and then you actually are able to performatively imagine what must have been said. And for that, it's also very helpful. So as I suggested, it started with 1930s. It is how the Nazis started. Disgraceful. Just one comment. These numbers on the top right, gray, are the number of people who approve the comment. So it doesn't have any sense of scale, because, you know, something like this approved is 930 times, but then you see that there's the most misogynist, racist comment is approved 2,000 times. So obviously it doesn't compute, and I don't understand the technical details behind it. So what I'll do, I'll read some. Because we don't have time, I won't be able to read even the ones that I selected, so I highlighted them. So we'll go through those highlights and get a sense of the kinds of discussions that it actually created. Jamie Pett says, am I paranoid if I speculate whether a disabled person on benefits isn't welcome in Westminster anymore? Westminster being the seat of government. Big Slaw says, Big Slav, this will be blocked by the courts. If you can't deport someone because they have a cat, I suspect having 4 kids in the local schools with all the social ties that come with that will be a breach of their human rights. Outrage from the Daily Mail. LOL. Proby24 has an elegant and simple thought. Fuck the European Convention of Human Rights. Rude Dude Jude, among other things, thinks if you can't afford to live where you live, you move somewhere where you can afford to live. Isn't that generally how society works? Or is that a naive view? Moving schools is really not that mental, you know. Some might even get a better quality of life. Scandal. Stomanek says, what I find laughably dishonest is the number of posters here claiming foul, breach of human rights, etc. And on the other, slamming the government for its failure to control public spending. Nobody is being deprived of housing. The law says local authorities are bound to provide housing benefit to those who qualify. That will continue. It will certainly benefit Liverpool fans who live in Camden. White Tangler thinks that you'll notice that the definition of disabled has recently been changed to suit the moral void that's the modernized Tory voice of failed neoliberalism. Remember that austerity provides a justification mantra of social mass exclusion and disempowerment to accompany prioritization of financial rights over human rights and selfishness over societal responsibility. 101 approvals. Bob Liv, responding to Joachim V1, says, where are their human rights violated? They have food, water, and accommodation. They just have to move. Tough, that's life. Many people move because of work requirements. What's the difference? Joachim V1, responding to Bob Liv, says, I don't need patronizing nor your Tory propaganda. This is an earlier response to Tory selfishness. No matter what you confabulate, these people are being kicked out of their homes, and that's enough for me as human rights violation. Daft as it may seem, by the way, has the most anti or over the boundaries of community standards comments suppressed. Says, social justice does not mean I should have to subsidize someone to live in Belgravia or Notting Hill, two posh neighborhoods in London. And we're not even mentioned in terms of boroughs that are considering these measures. Persian War, on the other hand, weighs in by saying, if it's a question of rights, then I quite fancy a house or flat on the north side of Onslow Square in South Kensington, very posh neighborhood. I'll take a flat in Thurlow Square, very specific where he wants to live, at a pinch. But I don't think the taxpayer is up for that. It won't last, says, and this country has the cheek to lecture other countries about human rights. 5 approvals. I think one of them was mine. Malden Glass has a social policy solution. There is plenty of space in the Falkland Islands. Hyle Cameron with 2 fingers says to Maiden Glass, let's send all the city bankers, in fact, and hedge fund managers and the rest of the spivs over there. Good riddance. Agency says, how is getting people a nice home in an affordable area anything like the Nazis? First, make a Nazi comparison loses the argument. Dark Y says, in response to Interested 2, the first step was to remove the rights of the Jews. This smacks of this. No approvals. Daft as it may seem comes back. And this time refers noir, moi noir. But that's happening to people who don't receive housing benefit too. So why are you trumpeting the rights of benefit claimants over non-benefit claimants? And then the response comes from noir, moi, noir, because they need a little more help. Now this is the one that I want to pause and think through and come back several times. This is by Agency, responding to Big Slav. And here it starts saying, problem is, they aren't being deported. This is the response again, this question, whether this is deportation or that. They can stay if they can find a shortfall, which we all know they can't, on one, in parenthetical remark, admittedly perverse level. If they go, it's because they choose to. And then in response to Agency, Sir Joshua Reynolds says, yeah, I think that's a fairly good reasoning. I had my clue for research there, right there. A good reasoning and a logic being expressed. So now that comment, let's go back to that comment. It's a very complex amalgam of emotions and thoughts. Agency starts with a confident announcement that this is not a deportation. Agency wants to prove that a competing commentator is wrong. The trouble is, it's not deportation, is Agency's point. Then Agency goes on to provide evidence for this confident claim. It says, they can stay if they can find a shortfall. Simple logic. Here, Agency is arguably concerned with the freedom of people to make their own choices. No violation of that. Agency implies that unlike deportations, the freedom of those people is not violated. They have a choice. Then, with a remarkable precision and succinctness, he claims that we all know that they can't. We all know that they can't. But this creates a logically induced crisis of conscience, I think right there and then. Having stated that they actually don't have this choice, that they're supposed to have, Agency is stuck. But here something happens. Something intervenes. Because agency realizes that this is a rather dubious claim, he admits the perversion of its logic. Agency recognizes that this logic is perverse. This logic, I shall suggest, is about delivering subjects over to the market with their ostensible freedom when we know they have none. That's the one that I want to underline and I want to work through. So what I want to suggest is, I'm going to come back to this phrase, that it is about delivering subjects over to the market with their ostensible freedom when we know they have none. Now, to say this, though, is not enough. I will need to illustrate, I feel, how a seemingly contradictory, if not perverse logic would make so much more sense. Hence the response, yeah, I think that's a fairly sound reasoning. To do this, I'll ask you to bear with me and think through security studies, a very different field from social policy analysis or cultural analysis, I admit. But I hope to illustrate that this logic has affinities with other logics that's been identified in security apparatuses. Then I will suggest that rather than assuming an ideological translation of this logic from security apparatuses and security field to another field, it is in fact the practical translation done by private security companies. And I want to be able to illustrate to you that it is not at the level of ideology or ideas that this logic is becoming more common sense, but practically it's being translated what used to be called the external into the internal, from outside to the inside, and breaking the boundaries between the two, making it almost impossible to detect where security policy begins and ends, and where social policy begins and ends. The two logics become blurred, not because of lack of logical clarity, but the practical work of actors and agents in the field. So I would like to then introduce two concepts from security studies. Let's mark them. I will come back to them several times. One is illiberalism, and the other one is outsourcing. So let me just now borrow from security studies and see how our colleagues there are sorting out these concepts as being applicable to in the security field. Concerning illiberalism, I'm going to draw on Didier Bigo and his colleagues and how they draw attention to gradual, fragmented, and fitful emergence of a security process over the last 10 years or so. They call this process as, in fact, insecuritization, and argue that authorities increasingly produce or aim to produce insecure subjects in the sense that securitization measures address their demands for security with routine practical responses. Bigo and Tuscala, for example, insist that, quote, though the effects of this field are creating illiberal practices, they are not the result of exceptional decisions taken by professionals of politics following a master plan. They are heterogeneous, globally incoherent, but nevertheless highly predictable in their local effects for the researchers examining these networks. For them, security should not be understood as arising from, responding to, and arising from any basic need defined independently of securitization process, such as survival, common good, rights, freedoms. Rather, insecuritization is a social and political process related to various practices that shape the structural competition between actors for legitimacy over definitions of security. The security effect of these practices of insecuritization is not the result of a specific strategy of a dominant actor. It really depends on the transformation of the logic of violence and its legitimate or illegitimate use. Although insecuritization features practices relying on various rhetorical and performative devices, such as exceptions, threats, unease, they inevitably involve, quote, mundane bureaucratic decisions of technical kind in everyday politics, routines of rationalization, management of numbers instead of persons, use of technologies, especially the ones which allow for communication, surveillance at a distance, through databases and the speed and exchange of information. They also emphasize that some in-securitization moves performed by bureaucracies, the media, private agents, are so embedded in these routines that they are never any longer discussed and presented as an exception, but on the contrary, as the continuation of routines and logics of freedom, or even they are presented as form of democratization. The results of the in-securitization process, therefore, for them, cannot be studied through the will of a dominant actor. The actors do not know the final results of the moves they are making, as the result depends on the field effect of many other actors making counter moves. Often these moves and counter moves traverse boundaries of states and spur transnational field effects. Because of these transnational field effects, it's not possible to draw a new boundary or even enact a new boundary between internal and everyday politics on the one side and the international and exceptional politics called security on the other side. Illiberalism becomes a dominant logic in securitization when these routines, justifications, and protocols and practices are disrupted, intentionally or unintentionally, by demands, claims for transparency, accountability, against injustice, or requests for openness. When these demands are articulated, the response as a counter move is practices of illiberalism. Oh no, not now. Not here. It's not part of the routine. It's not part of this framework. The response is. So there is, in other words, no space in securitization processes to make these kinds of demands. On the contrary, these demands create and embolden illiberalism. To put it another way, democracy becomes a nuisance for routine management of security. Now, there are many examples in comments posted during the debate on the benefit cap which illustrate that many people easily take up these positions of routine, evident, and reasonable character. If it is a technical decision, it must be right. And inability to render judgment by a different set of values on what is happening. And when those values are brought into play, they are often brought into play in a language of scandal, for lack of a better word. In fact, arguably, those who even to take the opposite view and question the routine and the managerial view are scandalized by the prospect of internal deportation, for example. They resort to rhetorical devices, such as the reference to Nazism, precisely because of the preponderance of the dominant logic and inability to articulate in any other vocabulary, because of the preponderance of this logic. This is illiberalism in security studies, but clearly there are signs that it is seeping into other fields of government in contemporary Britain. Now, if liberalism is a dominant logic of insecuritization, outsourcing has become its main technique of power. So I want to again draw from security studies to dwell a little bit on this notion of outsourcing, not so much as privatization, but outsourcing as a technique of power. Now here I will rely on Simon Chersterman and his colleagues, who documented the consequences of outsourcing from war, conflict, and security into fields such as prisons, schools, detention, hospitals, everyday spaces of social state. They argue that privatization captures only one, albeit a very small aspect of this transformation. Michael Likowski, as part of that group, for example, investigates the impact of outsourcing on the monopoly of violence, which is one of the fundamental tenets of the modern nation state. Whether for civilian functions such as prisons, schools, hospitals, or for military functions such as war or conflict, he argues that the result is that the state gradually and fitfully contracts out not only government functions, but also its monopoly over legitimate violence. This results in splintering of sovereign power and creates a significant accountability deficit. Similarly, Chersterman and Fisher find that although the privatization of security has been continuing relentlessly over the past decade with minimum legal or political accountability, the last decade is really significant. They say it is still striking that industry has taken such a lead role, industry meaning security industry, in debates over regulation, except when governments are forced to act by scandal. And even in response to scandal, the industry often plays a dominant role. Again, for lack of vocabulary, being scandalized and bringing scandal into political vocabulary that agents are able to articulate some claims, but not too much effect. Now, you may be wondering why I have digressed to talk about illiberalism and outsourcing from security studies. What I want to now argue that while it is one thing to illustrate the alarming effects of the emergence of private security companies during wars and conflicts, privatizing state functions, and removing many operations even further away from democratic and public control and scrutiny, it is even more troubling, deeply troubling, to illustrate such effects in basic public services that the state provides in justice, health, welfare, and policing. But instead of drawing a conclusion to demonstrate how illiberalism and outsourcing are changing the welfare state, I will briefly draw your attention now to agents, as I said earlier, who are doing this translation practically. Because the consequences, I think, suggest different meaning. It is in their work that illiberalism and outsourcing become connected and actualized. Once I have done this, then you'll see that we will arrive elsewhere. On 16 July 2012, the Financial Times reported a remarkable set of findings that hardly incited any discussion at all, at least so far as I could find. It reported that since 2008, the onset of the economic crisis that's gripped Europe, the biggest wave of outsourcing of public services has also occurred in Britain. Quoting a study by Jefferies, a global investment banking firm, it reported that more than £4 billion of tenders were in the government's pipeline in 2012 alone, with three key departments: Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Defense, and the third is most of interest to us, the Department of Work and Pensions. That's the department that is in charge of the benefits cap administration. Being in the front line. Although outsourcing has become a well-known strategy in the defense sector, the FD piece outlines how the outsourcing, quote, spectrum ranges from virgin care, providing health visitors to newborn babies at one end, to private equity firms running nursing homes for the elderly at the other. End of quote. The collective growth of the sector, dominated by FTSE 100 giants, G4S, Capita, and Serco, just to mark this, these are private security companies that came into being during Afghanistan and Iraq wars, has been impressive. In health sector, G4S runs ambulances. Serco is in a joint venture to run a pathology unit at Guy's and St. Thomas NHS National Health Service Foundation Trust. And Virgin Care is a big player in the market for running sexual health clinics. Now, those of you who don't know these companies, they're the private security companies that are beneficiaries of the so-called war on terror. In justice, already 14 of the 140 prisons in England and Wales are privately operated. They are outsourced. And 15% of the total 89,000 inmates reside in private prisons. In welfare, the FT reports that a key element of the welfare reform bill, which is part of this welfare benefits cap that we've been discussing, is the introduction of more rigid testing to support benefit claims. Much of this rigid benefit claims testing is done by private contractors. G4S recently estimated that its annual revenue from welfare assessment services alone could reach as much as 300 million pounds as the government cuts billions of pounds from the welfare bill. Welfare to work has already been outsourced, with G4S and Serco among the big providers. About 6 months later, and this is more recent, on 31st January 2013, the Financial Times follows this up with the headline news that outsourcing soars in public services. Again, not without really any debate, commentary, or discussion in the following days. It reports emphatically that tens of thousands of health, defense, security, and IT workers have already been transferred to corporate employers as the overall value of such contracts, won by companies such as, now the list is growing, Babcock, G4S, Serco, Capita, MITI, Carillion, has risen from £9.6 billion in 2008 to £20.4 billion in 2012. That's, by the way, that 20 billion is exactly the amount that the government is cutting from welfare. So that gives a different inflection on what cutting means. I'll come back to that. This was according to the annual analysis of the official journal of the European Union database. This piece continues with the coalition reporting, quote, with the coalition seeking to achieve 20 billion of cost savings by 2015, room remains for the private sector to extend its reach further. According to Seymour Pierce, the brokerage that carried out an analysis, Seymour Pierce has identified 1,789 outsourcing contracts worth 84 billion pounds, 4 times the cut to the welfare sector, in the government pipeline. Total public sector outsourcing, Financial Times reports, could reach 101 billion pounds by 2015 alone. That's 5 times the size of the welfare cut. Arguably, the story here is not one of decline of the welfare state or shrinking of public services. In fact, within a few years, it may well be reported that both welfare payments and public services have in fact increased in real monetary terms. To me, the story here is perhaps a fundamental transformation of the state, precipitated by the strategy of outsourcing, resulting primarily an illiberal mode of government. This transformation amounts to no less than the blurring the boundaries between states and markets, as states become increasingly agents of delivering subjects over to markets. The very function of the state is becoming delivering subjects over to the markets. It is in the creation of markets that the state is playing a significant role. Outsourcing is effectively about creating these privatized markets. For now, ostensibly public services. To recall one of the commentators on benefit cap, this is a perverse logic. The state pushes its citizens into precarious conditions as a policy, not as a master plan, not as a strategy, not as a program, but gradually, fitfully, by various actors who have been active in the security field, that field being shrinking, there are new invasions forthcoming, that field being shrinking, then they are looking for other markets. And the outsourcing of public services by states is the primary market through which to grow for these private security companies. This is what I mean by delivering subjects over to markets. Then the questions arise. Where is the difference between states and markets, which is the linchpin of at least mainstream economic theory, and between national and international. The main tenet of international relations theory, at least the mainstream, this difference between the national and international. These private companies are not only vying for delivering public services, but they are organized as thoroughly transnational companies. Thoroughly transnational companies. So when the states are delivering subjects over to these markets, they are also transnationalizing their own citizens, but without actually calling that. Now, these are urgent questions that require meticulous responses. Yet I have still not arrived at the question I want to pursue. That's why I ask for your patience in the beginning. Bear with me. I still haven't arrived at the question I want to articulate. A question that I hinted at in the beginning, that there is something else is happening. To me, what I have just so far outlined is the beginning point to articulate the question. I've also dwelled on, or rather shall we say danced or hovered around that phrase, how citizens are delivered over to markets as private consumers of public services. Now we must recognize that the rights of citizens, as a first move to get a grip on this logic, we must recognize that the rights of citizens are fundamentally different from the rights of consumers. From political subjectivity to commercial subjectivity in governing ourselves is not a short distance, and it precipitates entirely different repertoires of action and descriptions of subjectivity under which we can enact ourselves as subjects. I have already drawn attention to the relation between outsourcing as a governmental strategy and illiberalism as its logic. But as a logic, illiberalism, like liberalism and neoliberalism, is not something that is imposed from above, but it emerges, if gradually and fitfully, through various trials and errors of governmentalization of an object, in this case, the social welfare field, or rather something becoming an object of government. Nor do I want to give you an impression that these rationalities of government, these three, liberalism, neoliberalism, and illiberalism, necessarily supplant or replace each other. In fact, perhaps, however counterintuitive this may sound, all three may have been present for 2 centuries. Subjects are interpolated or incited to take up certain positions and give themselves over to certain ways of being and acting, and each of these rationalities of government is oriented toward different objectives. The question then is, how does illiberalism mobilize subjects in delivering them over to markets? How does it accomplish its objectives? What kind of practices it puts into place? What kinds of positions we are asked to take up? Those are the specific questions that I want to ask. The question then concerns drawing a relationship between outsourcing and illiberalism on the one hand, and the emerging discussions in social and political theory. Now, what I want to draw your attention to at this point, having posed this question, how does illiberalism mobilize subjects in delivering them over to markets? This doesn't happen without grounded practical thought. Grounded practical thought that responds to specific problems. But it doesn't happen also without thought that spreads, disseminates, articulates itself as theory, articulates itself as a mandate, articulates itself as a claim, articulates itself as a government program and strategy. And there are affinities and resonances between what is happening in high political theory and, if you like, low political theory, on the ground, at the practical stage. And the resonances between the two are absolutely significant for us to be able to respond to this question: how does illiberalism mobilize subjects in delivering them over to markets? Having said that then, over the last decade, the fact that there has been a growing interest in libertarian paternalism and coercive paternalism is of interest to me. In the last decade, for those of you who may have followed discussions, in certain parts of political theory, social theory, there is a growing movement of thought that calls itself, first it was libertarian paternalism, and now more recently it's calling it coercive paternalism, and it works and operates or advances its claims at various registers. Sometimes as a governmental program, sometimes as a governmental strategy offered to governments. For example, you might be interested to know that two government advisors to the Conservative government in 2010, when it was elected, were actually explicitly relying on a well-received book called Nudge, which I'm going to talk to you about, which is sort of the first book that talked about libertarian paternalism, and drew up the manifesto of the Conservative government in Britain, and then it was deeply engaged with drawing up, when it was elected, in various policies. So there is also a demonstrable dissemination, if you like, more than logical resonances. And this debate on first libertarian paternalism and coercive paternalism has been about whether, benignly put, if you like, whether governments should have the right to intervene in the lives of their citizens when they deem that those citizens do not know what is best for them. I hope you're seeing where am I getting, or at least I feel I'm getting, the connections between illiberalism and outsourcing and the development of a mentality, a logic that agency has so articulately put forward, but now we are looking at more different versions of that. So let me repeat that. The debate has been about whether government should have the right to intervene in the lives of their citizens when they deem that those citizens do not know what is best for them. So if as a government we think that some of our citizens should live in Liverpool as opposed to Camden, we may well be justified to make that decision as a routine management decision. There is nothing to be concerned about this. Now this, the question then turns, if so, how this should be accomplished. Now, two of the authors, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, are the authors of this book called Nudge, that was published, I think, in 2003, and then in a blog, after several years, Cass Sunstein provided a more sort of down-to-earth understanding of what is at stake with Nudge. And this is what he said. For several years, Richard and I, Cass, have been working on this topic of libertarian paternalism. The basic idea is that private and public institutions might nudge people in directions that will make their lives go better without eliminating freedom of choice. The paternalism consists in the nudge. Libertarianism consists in the insistence on freedom. Not giving freedom, insistence on freedom as a theoretical idea. Practically, it might not work. And on imposing little or no cost on those who seek to go their own way. Very ambiguous. Is it a little cost to move from Camden as a family to Liverpool, where you lived for 30 years? Who is going to calculate that cost? And who is going to judge whether that is little or not? It's probably a routine management issue. I shouldn't be asking these questions. The libertarianism then consists on the insistence on freedom and on imposing little or no cost on those who seek to go their own way. One of our central arguments, he says, is that because default rules and starting points often matter, institutions can't avoid nudging people, and hence can't avoid a kind of paternalism, or at least a nudge. Now, the main argument has been whether also in economic theory, rational choice model, which assumes that actors made the right choices in their discussions, is being replaced with a view that no longer assumes a rational actor. If so, what is the appropriate choice theory in governing consumers? And what is the appropriate approach in governing citizens becomes questions. Now we can go on, and I think I'm running out of time, to look at more closely how nudge disseminates itself, how articulates various principles, and how those principles also spread from one government to another and becomes, in effect, also a transnational program. But I want to draw actually your attention to even more recent development in the last 2 years, maybe even a year, maybe within months, where very strongly this libertarian paternalism is being replaced with a new strand in a dominant way, something called coercive libertarianism. Now, this coercive libertarianism is taking unexpected paths that we have to pay attention to. It emerges from discussions in rational actor theory, but it asks, if so, what is the appropriate choice theory if we can no longer assume that people are not rational, cannot make the decisions that are good for them? In a telling phrase, this was expressed by one of the proponents of this view, coercive paternalism, Waldman. It's called outsourcing self-government. This is outsourcing, governing ourselves, giving account of ourselves, is being outsourced to others. In a remarkable passage I'm going to read you, he says, quote, "At issue, whether you should cede your ability to make decisions about your own life to someone who would likely make better decisions for you than you would for yourself. And by ceding one's ability to make decisions, what is meant is not merely deferring to another's judgment. This is not about asking advice, but relinquishing one's role as the ultimate arbiter of one's actions and choices. Your decider, then, whether a despot, a committee, or a friend, there is no difference in kind, would be no mere advisor. He would not seek your compliance in ways that enable you to train final say over your actions and choices. Rather, he would preempt your decisions, make them for you, or interfere in your decision, making so that you could not help but decide according to his will." Now, the emerging dominant idea here is not that this logic is applicable to every subject, every actor. And it becomes even more complicated. But the emerging consensus among this group of theorists is that, I'm quoting now, only those who desire to be self-governing have reason to be self-governing. Now, high theory or not, I think it's perverse. Okay, so agency and this thought are in agreement. Except that agency has the conscience to pause and ask, isn't this perverse? Translated into theory, no need for pause. It is. Only those who desire to be self-governing have reason to be self-governing. What about those who do not desire? Who assesses people's desire? What measures do we have? And then goes on and says, if self-government means having final authority over one's decision, really we have come to a point, quote, there is no intrinsic value in having such authority, even over decisions that concern the direction and shape one's life. Now, if such arguments against autonomy is becoming prevalent, my question is, I wonder if they're not related to illiberalism becoming a dominant logic by which the state is governed today. And the suggestion I'm making here is not that there's a program being articulated in social and political studies and then is applied in social and economic policy. I'm drawing your attention to the social conditions of possibility of a logic that traverses distinct fields of knowledge and power that orientated toward the objective delivering of subjects over into markets and the associated rationalities being produced in various different disciplines. So for critical thought, for critical theory, the task becomes drawing out these strands, bringing them to the fore, and drawing attention to patterns of dissemination, patterns of transfer that are transnational between what I call low theory, high theory, grounded theory, and various practices. But what I want to do is now to conclude in the next minute is to ask, okay, what is the scandal of rights here? What is exactly the operation here? At first glance, it's the most obvious one. The state that's supposed to guarantee the safety and protection of the citizen has become the worst offender of rights. Moreover, the state that's supposed to hold up such rights is being institutionally dismantled and transnationalized at the practical level. If the continuing outsourcing of public services to private companies continues apace, it's not the rights of citizens, but the rights, if they're called as such at all, of consumers of such services will be pressed into service. Yet, the most troubling scandal is still not that, I think. As scandalous as those movements are, to me, the most troubling scandal is that this outsourcing cannot continue without intensifying illiberalism as practices of government and its associated discursive agents, such as libertarian or coercive paternalism. It also follows that a new figure of citizen whose subjectivity is no longer a claims-making, but for whom decision will be made by those who are authorized to make such decisions, is taking hold of the social and political body. If I were to stop right there, I think I will have been pleased to have articulated finally a question for you. But I thought that I should be just a bit even more ambitious and articulate even a question that I can't begin to develop a response to. But at the same time, since it presented itself to me, this ambitious question, I want to end with that question as the concluding part of this lecture. Then it makes me think, if the business of the state was government in the 19th and 20th centuries, has the government of the state become business in the 21st? I think it raises that question, and I don't have an answer. Thanks very much.